My sister smiled at me from across my father's hospital bed the night he died. It wasn't a sad smile. It wasn't even a polite one. It was the kind of smile that told me she already knew something I didn't. Before we begin, if stories like this speak to something you've felt before, that quiet fear that the people closest to you might not be who you think they are, subscribe to the channel. Because this one is going to stay with you. My name is Caroline Merritt. I was 43 years old when my father, James Merritt, passed away on a Tuesday evening in late October. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee. Outside, the leaves were turning orange and red, which felt almost cruel in its beauty. My father had spent 40 years as a high school history teacher in Clover Falls, Ohio. He wasn't a wealthy man in the way people usually mean when they say that. But he owned a house, a piece of land just outside town, and a small hardware store on Main Street that had been in our family for 3 generations. To me, those things weren't just property. They were him. They were every Saturday morning he spent behind that counter. Every summer evening he mowed that land with an old riding mower, humming to himself while I sat on the porch watching him. They were the smell of sawdust and motor oil and the way the floorboards of that store creaked in the exact same spot every single time. My sister, Diana, was 2 years younger than me. We had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, shared the same bedroom until she was 12 and I was 14, and we finally convinced our father to convert the small sewing room into a second bedroom. For most of our childhood, we were close. We fought the way sisters do, borrowed each other's clothes without asking, stayed up late telling secrets. But somewhere along the way, I couldn't tell you exactly when, Diana had changed. Or maybe I had. Or maybe the woman she became was always hiding inside the little girl I grew up with, and I just hadn't seen it. By the time we were adults, Diana had married a man named Greg Patton. Greg worked in commercial real estate. He wore expensive watches and talked about property values the way other people talk about the weather. Constantly, casually, as though there was no other topic worth discussing. They lived in a large house in Columbus, drove matching SUVs, and took vacations to places that required passports. Diana had stopped working after their second child was born, and from the outside, their life looked like something from a catalog. I, on the other hand, had taken a different road. I had stayed in Clover Falls. I had worked at my father's hardware store through my 20s, helped him through my mother's illness when she was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, and cared for her through the last 2 years of her life when she needed full-time help. After my mother passed, I stayed. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because my father needed me. Because someone had to stay. I never resented Diana for leaving. Not at first. She had her life, her family, her ambitions. I understood. But there were small moments, over the years, that planted seeds of something uncomfortable in the back of my mind. The way she would come home for Christmas and immediately begin talking about the house, how it needed new gutters, how the kitchen was dated, how the land out back could be worth something if someone ever developed it. The way she talked about the hardware store as though it were a burden our father was too stubborn to put down. The way she looked at everything he owned as though she were already measuring it. I told myself I was being uncharitable. She was just being practical, I thought. That's just Diana. But when my father got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that doesn't get better, Diana came home for the first time in nearly 2 years. She arrived on a Friday afternoon with her hair perfectly done and her luggage matching. She hugged our father and cried real tears, and I watched her and told myself again that I was being unfair. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing in that hospital hallway, was that Diana had already been to see a lawyer. Not after our father died. Before. She had been planning something for months, maybe longer, and every smile she gave me in that hospital room was the smile of someone who believed they had already won. Our father held on for 11 days. In that time, Diana stayed in the guest room of his house, my childhood home, and I slept in my old bedroom, the one with the window that faced the backyard. In the evenings, after we came back from the hospital, Diana and I would sit at the kitchen table and drink tea and talk about our father, about our memories, about the future. Those conversations felt real to me. They felt like the sister I had grown up with was still in there somewhere. On the last night, the nurses called us both. We drove to the hospital together in the dark. The October sky was clear and cold and full of stars. My father was unconscious but breathing. We sat on either side of his bed and held his hands. At some point Diana reached across the bed and took my hand too. And the three of us were connected like that when his breathing slowed and then stopped. I cried for a long time. Diana cried too. And then, when the nurse came in and quietly confirmed what we already knew, Diana dried her eyes, stood up, smoothed her jacket, and gave me that smile. I didn't understand it then. I just thought grief does strange things to people. I thought she was in shock. I reached for an explanation that didn't require me to think badly of my sister, because that's what I always did with Diana. 3 days later, I sat in the office of an attorney named Robert Calloway. He had been our father's lawyer for over 20 years, a quiet man with reading glasses and a habit of tapping his pen against his notepad. I had assumed we were there to hear our fathers will read together, Diana and I side by side. But Diana wasn't there. And when Robert opened the folder on his desk and looked at me over the top of his glasses, something in his expression told me I wasn't going to like what came next. "Caroline," he said carefully, "there's something you need to know." Robert Calloway had the kind of face that kept its composure even when the words coming out of it were not composed at all. He had known our family since before I was in high school. He had drawn up our parents' wills, handled our mother's estate when she passed, reviewed contracts for the hardware store. He knew our family in the way that small-town lawyers do, not just as clients, but as people. Which is probably why he looked genuinely troubled that afternoon. "Your father had a will," he said. "One that he signed 12 years ago. In that document, the property, the store, and his remaining assets were to be divided equally between you and Diana. 50-50. I nodded. That was what I had expected. That was what felt right. However, Robert continued, and he paused there just long enough for something cold to settle in my chest. 3 months ago, your father signed a new document. A revised will. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. The new document leaves the family home, the land, and the hardware store entirely to Diana. Your name does not appear in it. The room went very quiet. Through the window behind Robert's desk, I could see Main Street. I could see the hardware store from where I sat, its green awning, the window display that I had set up myself last spring with seed packets and garden tools arranged in a little scene that made my father laugh when he saw it. "That can't be right," I said. My voice was very steady. I remember being surprised by that. "I know this is difficult," Robert said. "He wouldn't have done that. He never would have done that without talking to me. The document is properly witnessed and notarized. But Caroline," he leaned forward slightly, "I have to tell you something. I did not draft that will. I had no knowledge of it until 2 weeks ago, when Diana's attorney contacted me. Your father used a different lawyer to draw it up. A firm in Columbus that I don't have a relationship with. I've already requested the full file, and I have some concerns about the circumstances under which it was signed." I looked at him. What kind of concerns? He was quiet for a moment. "Your father had been on a significant amount of pain medication in the months before his death. He was also beginning to show early signs of cognitive decline. His doctor had noted it at least twice in his chart. I'm not in a position to make legal conclusions right now, but what I can tell you is that you have grounds to contest this." I sat in that chair for what felt like a very long time without speaking. I was thinking about my father, about the 11 days in the hospital, about Diana arriving with her matching luggage and her real tears, about all the evenings she had spent alone with him while I ran back to the house to cook dinner or pick up his prescriptions from the pharmacy, about how many times she had been in that room with him without me there. Did Diana know? I asked. Before he died, did she already know about the will? Robert took a breath. Based on when the document was signed and the attorney of record, it is very possible that she was involved in the process. Whether she initiated it or influenced it, that's what we'd need to investigate. I drove home in a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the kind of silence that fills up with everything you're not saying, everything your brain is trying to organize before it lets you feel any of it. I parked in front of my father's house, the house I grew up in, and I sat in the car for a long time staring at the front door. Diana's rental car was in the driveway. She opened the door before I knocked. She was holding a cup of tea, dressed in a cream-colored blouse, and she looked at me the way you look at someone you've been waiting for. "How did it go?" she asked. I looked at her face. I looked at it the way you look at a photograph you've seen 100 times but suddenly notice something in the background that changes everything. "You already know how it went," I said. She didn't deny it. She stepped back to let me in and said, "Come inside, Caroline. We should talk." We sat in the living room. Our father's chair was still in its place by the window, still with the worn armrests and the little table beside it where he kept his reading glasses and his crossword puzzle book. I sat on the couch across from Diana and I watched her fold her hands in her lap and I waited. "Dad wanted to make sure I was taken care of," she said. "He knew you've always been more capable. You've always been able to handle things on your own. I have children, a family to think about, and with the real estate market." "Stop," I said. She stopped. "Did you take him to that lawyer in Columbus?" She was quiet for a moment. "I drove him to an appointment. Yes. He asked me to. When he was on oxycodone and couldn't remember what day it was half the time. He knew exactly what he was doing." "Diana." My voice was still very calm. "I don't know how. He called me last Christmas and asked me 3 times what year it was. He thought Mom was still alive for about 20 minutes one afternoon in September. He signed something in a lawyer's office in Columbus while I was running this house and taking him to chemotherapy twice a week. And you want me to believe that was his clear and independent decision?" Diana's jaw tightened. "I didn't put any words in his mouth." "But you were there. You were in the room." "I was there because he wanted me there." We stared at each other across our father's living room, with his reading glasses still on the little table and his crossword book still open to a puzzle he would never finish, and I understood something in that moment that I had been refusing to understand for years. Diana had not become someone different. She had always been this person. I had just loved her enough not to see it clearly. "I'll be out of the house by Friday," I said. She looked briefly relieved, which told me everything. "Caroline, I'm not trying to push you out." "I'll be out by Friday," I said again, and I got up and walked down the hall to my father's room, and I sat on the edge of his bed, and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself feel it. I stayed in that room for a long time, looking at his things. The photo on the dresser of him and my mother on their wedding day. The small wooden box where he kept his father's old watch. The stack of history books on his nightstand, most of them bookmarked at chapters he would never finish reading. And then I noticed something. In the space behind those books, pushed back against the wall so that you wouldn't see it unless you were sitting exactly where I was sitting, there was a small notebook. A dark blue spiral notebook, the kind you can buy for $1 at any drugstore. My father's handwriting on the cover in black marker. Private. I reached for it slowly. If you've ever lost a parent, you know there's a particular kind of grief that comes not from the loss itself but from the things you find out afterward. The things they kept quiet to protect you. The things they witnessed alone that you wish you could have helped them carry. That notebook broke me open. And I want to pause here, before I tell you what was inside it, and say, if there's someone in your life right now that you've been meaning to call, someone you've been putting off because you think there's more time, this story is a reminder that there isn't always more time. If that hits you, leave a comment below. I think a lot of us are carrying that weight tonight. My father's handwriting had changed. I noticed it immediately. The letters were larger than they used to be, slightly uneven. The way handwriting looks when someone is writing slowly and carefully because they know their hands aren't entirely reliable anymore. But the words were his. The voice was absolutely his. The notebook had no dates at first, just entries. Observations. Thoughts he seemed to be writing down because he didn't want to forget them, or because he wanted someone to find them eventually. The first few pages were about my mother. About the years they had spent together. About how much he missed her. About a trip they took to the Oregon coast before she got sick, how she had stood at the edge of the water and let the wind take her hair, and how he had thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his whole life. I had to stop reading for a while after those pages. I set the notebook in my lap and looked out the window and breathed. Then I turned the page, and everything changed. He had written about Diana. Not in the way a father writes about a child he loves, though that was underneath it, always. He wrote about conversations she had been having with him in the months after his diagnosis. About how she had started calling more often, which he had been grateful for at first, because he was lonely and scared and she was his daughter. About how she had started asking questions about the house and the store. About property values. About what he intended to do with things. About what she thought he should do with things. He had written, "She means well. I believe she means well. But I feel pressure." 3 pages later he wrote, "Diana brought papers to the house today. She said they were just to protect everyone. I told her I needed to think. She stayed for 4 days. And then, I asked to call Robert. Diana said Robert charges too much and that this was simpler. I was very tired. I read those words 4 times. I was very tired. For words that contained an entire story of a man whose defenses had been worn down by pain and medication and loneliness and a daughter who had stayed for 4 days and called it love. Then I found the dates. Toward the back of the notebook, the entries had dates. The signed will, according to Robert, had been executed on a Thursday in July. My father had written an entry 2 days before that trip to Columbus. It said, "I do not want to leave Caroline with nothing. She is the one who stayed. She is the one who knows where everything is and what it means. I am going to call her tonight and tell her what's happening. Diana says it will cause a fight. I am going to call anyway." And then, the day after the Columbus trip, a single sentence. "I think I made a mistake but I don't know how to undo it now." I sat on my father's bed with that notebook in my hands and I understood something terrible and clarifying. He had known. Somewhere underneath the medication and the confusion and the exhaustion, he had known something wasn't right. He had written it down. He had left it where someone might find it. He had left it where I might find it. I took photographs of every page with my phone. I then put the notebook carefully in my bag. I walked out to the living room where Diana was on her phone, typing something, and I looked at her across the room and thought, "You don't know about this notebook. You don't know what he left behind." And for the first time since sitting in Robert Calloway's office, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. Not yet. Something quieter and more focused, like a flashlight turning on in a dark room. "I'm going to get some air," I said. Diana barely looked up. "Okay." I drove to the end of our street and I parked and I called Robert Calloway. "I found something," I said when he picked up. "A notebook. My father's handwriting. Entries about the will, about Diana bringing papers to the house, about feeling pressured. And an entry dated 2 days before the Columbus trip saying he didn't want to leave me with nothing." There was a silence on the other end. Then Robert said, "Can you bring it to my office tomorrow morning?" "I'll be there at 8, I said. "Caroline." He paused. "Don't tell Diana about this." "I wasn't planning to," I said. That night I slept in my father's bed. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the room he had been in last. Maybe because it still smelled faintly of him, his soap and his old flannel shirt hanging on the back of the door. Diana was down the hall. I lay in the dark and I listened to the silence of the house and I thought about my father alone in this room in the summer, writing in that notebook by lamplight, too tired to fight, too loyal to say nothing. He couldn't fight for himself anymore. But he had left me the tools to fight for both of us. I thought about Greg Patton's expensive watch and Diana's matching luggage and the way she had asked me 3 times last Thanksgiving if I'd ever thought about selling the hardware store. I thought about all the small signals I had talked myself out of noticing. And I thought about what my father had written in that very last entry before he stopped writing altogether. I hope Caroline finds this. She'll know what to do. Robert Calloway spent 40 minutes with me the next morning, the notebook open on his desk between us, photographing each page himself and making notes in his careful handwriting. His reading glasses were perched low on his nose and he didn't speak much while he worked, but I could tell from the set of his jaw that what he was reading mattered. When he was done, he sat back and laced his fingers together. "This is significant," he said. "Not conclusive on its own, but significant. Combined with his medical records, the documented cognitive decline, the pain medication levels, and combined with the circumstances of the will's execution, this gives us a very real case for undue influence and potential lack of testamentary capacity." "What does that mean in plain language?" I asked. It means we can challenge the will in probate court. It means a judge will look at whether your father was truly capable of making an independent, fully informed decision when he signed that document. And based on what's in this notebook, based on the medical record, and based on the fact that a 68-year-old man with stage 3 cancer and documented memory lapses signed a new will in a strange lawyer's office in another city while accompanied only by the person who stood to benefit most from it, he paused. I think we have a strong argument. How long will this take? I asked. Probate litigation can take anywhere from several months to a couple of years. It depends on how hard Diana fights back. She'll fight hard, I said. Greg will make sure of that. Robert nodded like he had expected that answer. There's something else I want to look into. I've requested the full file from the Columbus attorney. I want to see the notes from the signing, who was present, what was said, how the questions were put to your father. There should be a record. If Diana was in the room during the signing itself, that's a significant problem for her case. I left his office and walked down Main Street. I walked past the hardware store. I stopped in front of it and looked at my own reflection in the glass of the front door. The store was closed. I had closed it temporarily after the funeral, telling the 2 part-time employees I'd be in touch. Through the glass I could see the familiar shelves, the old wooden counter my grandfather had built, the little office in the back where my father used to eat his lunch and listen to the radio. 3 generations of Merritts had run that store. My grandfather had opened it with money he saved working the railroads. My father had taken it over at 26. I had spent half my life in its aisles. And now my sister, who had not set foot inside it in over 8 years, had it on paper. I wasn't going to let that stand. But I also knew I had to be patient. I had to be careful. I had to let Robert do his work while I did mine. Because there was something else I needed to understand. Something that went beyond the notebook, beyond the medical records, beyond the legal arguments. I needed to understand when Diana had first started planning this. It took me 3 weeks of quiet work to find out. I went through my father's old bank records, which I still had access to as his former power of attorney before the illness worsened. I went through receipts and emails he had printed and kept in a folder in his desk, because my father didn't trust digital things and preferred hard copies of everything. And I called 2 people, Mrs. Elaine Forsyth, who lived next door and visited my father for coffee every Sunday morning, and Tommy Driscoll, one of the part-time employees at the store who had worked there since he was in high school and who had genuine loyalty to our family. Mrs. Forsyth told me that Diana had visited 4 times in the 18 months before our father died. Not the twice I had known about. 4 times. And at least 2 of those visits, she said, Diana had come alone and spent time at the house while I was at the store. Your father mentioned once that Diana had been helping him with some paperwork, Mrs. Forsyth told me over the phone, her voice careful. He seemed confused about it. He said he wasn't sure he'd understood everything he signed, but that Diana told him it was all routine. I remember it because it seemed to bother him. I wrote it all down. Every word. Tommy told me something different. He told me that about 6 months before my father died, a man had come into the store. Not a regular customer. A man in a good suit who had walked through the whole store slowly, looking at everything with that measuring kind of attention that means someone is calculating value, not browsing. Tommy had asked if he could help and the man had given a vague answer about checking out local businesses in the area and left without buying anything. Did he give a name? I asked. Not to me. But he left a card on the counter when he thought nobody was looking. I picked it up after he left. A pause. I still have it. The card belonged to a commercial real estate company based in Columbus. It was one of the firms that Greg Patton had done business with in the past. I confirmed that with a single search online. Greg had sent someone to assess the store. Before my father died. Before the will was even contested. Greg had been moving pieces on this board while my father was still alive, while I was still in that house every single day, while I was still thinking of my sister as someone who grieved differently but ultimately loved the same. I sat with all of this for a full day before I brought it to Robert. When I laid it in front of him, the timeline, the testimonies, the business card connection, I watched his expression move from careful to something that looked almost like quiet satisfaction. This paints a picture, he said. It paints a very clear picture, I said. I received the file from the Columbus attorney yesterday, he said. There's something you need to see. He slid a page across the desk. It was a notarized record of the signing. Present at the time of signing, James Merritt, the attorney, a paralegal, and one other party listed as a family member who had accompanied Mr. Merritt to the appointment. Diana Merritt Patton. She had been in the room. Attorneys are supposed to ensure that a will is signed without undue influence, Robert said quietly. That means family members who stand to benefit should typically not be present during the signing. This attorney allowed it, which tells me either he was careless or he was not asking the right questions. Either way, it supports our argument. When do we file? I asked. I've already begun the paperwork, he said. We'll file the contest in probate court by the end of the week. I drove home that evening past the old house. Diana's rental car was gone. She had gone back to Columbus. The house was dark. I didn't stop. But as I passed the hardware store, I slowed down. I sat idling in front of it in the gathering dark and I thought about my father's voice. About the way he'd walk through those aisles straightening things that didn't need straightening just because he liked the feel of it. About the way he'd unlock the front door every morning like it was still a privilege. I was going to fight for this. For him. For every day he had put into something that mattered. And for every day someone in his own family had looked at it and seen nothing but a number. I was going to fight. And I was going to win. What Diana didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, sitting in her big Columbus house, confident and comfortable, was that the notebook was not the only thing my father had left me. There was something else. Something that neither Robert nor I had found yet, but that I would find 2 days later, tucked inside the wooden box where my father kept his father's watch. A letter. Handwritten. Addressed to me. My father's handwriting on the envelope was the old version of his handwriting. The clear, even script from before he got sick, from the years when his hands were steady and his thoughts were his own completely. Which meant he had written it long before Diana arrived with her papers and her patients and her 4-day visit. Inside was 3 pages, front and back. I stood in his bedroom in the morning light and I read every word without sitting down, because somehow sitting down felt like I would come apart. He had written about the hardware store, about the history of it, things I already knew and things I didn't, that his father had almost lost it in 1971 during a rough stretch, that a neighbor had quietly lent him the money to keep it, that this neighbor had refused to be repaid and had only said bring people into the store and treat them right and we're even. My grandfather had done exactly that for 40 years. He had written about me, about the choice I had made to stay in Clover Falls, to stay close, to learn the store and run it alongside him. He wrote, I never told you enough what that meant to me. I was raised to believe that men didn't say those things. I'm saying it now. You made my last years less lonely. I don't have the words for what that's worth. He had written about Diana, too, and it was not cruel. He said he understood what had happened between her and her husband and money, that he had watched Greg's ambition shape Diana into someone who saw the world through a different lens, that he didn't entirely blame her for it, but that he was not blind to it either. He wrote, she has always needed more than what she had. I don't know where that came from. It didn't come from your mother or from me. But I see it in her. And I'm sorry that you've had to live alongside it. And then the final paragraph. The one that made me hold the letter against my chest and stand very still in the quiet of that room. He wrote, I had a will drawn up by Robert 12 years ago that leaves everything to you and Diana equally. I believe that will is the right one. I believe it reflects my true wishes, made when I was healthy and thinking clearly. I am writing this letter so that you have my voice, Caroline, not just my signature. Whatever happens with lawyers and papers and things I may or may not be able to understand when I'm sick and tired and not myself, I want you to know that my intention, my real intention, has always been for this to go to you both equally. And I want you to fight for that. Don't let this go quietly. I called Robert that afternoon. He wrote a letter, I said. Long before Diana got involved. Clearly in his own words. Clearly in his right mind based on the handwriting and the content. Stating his original intention for the will. Asking me to fight for it. Robert was quiet for a moment. Bring it in, he said. Bring it in today. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, for months after my father died. The courthouse in Clover Falls was a small one, 100-year-old stone building with high ceilings and tall windows, and I arrived early enough to sit alone in the hall outside the courtroom and feel the weight of the morning. Diana arrived with Greg and their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman from Columbus who wore her hair pulled back tight and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. Diana was dressed in dark blue. She didn't look at me when she walked past. Greg looked at me. It was a brief look, the kind that says he considered me an obstacle rather than a person, and I looked back at him steadily until he looked away. Robert had prepared carefully. He presented the medical records, the documented cognitive decline, the pain medication levels, the notes from my father's doctor. He presented the timeline he had reconstructed from the bank records and Mrs. Forsyth's account of Diana's 4 visits. He presented the record of Diana's presence in the room during the signing. He presented Tommy Driscoll's testimony about the man from the Columbus real estate firm. And then he presented the notebook. He read portions of it aloud in the courtroom. My father's voice in Robert's careful cadence, filling that high-ceilinged room. I am going to call her tonight. Diana says it will cause a fight. I am very tired. I think I made a mistake. Diana's attorney objected at several points. The judge, a methodical woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Patricia Morrow, noted the objections and overruled most of them. Then Robert presented the letter. Diana's attorney argued that a handwritten letter was not a legal document, that it carried no weight against a properly notarized will, and that whatever personal sentiments it contained were irrelevant to the question of legal validity. Judge Morrow read the letter. She read all 3 pages. And when she looked up, there was something in her expression that was not entirely judicial. I'll note for the record, she said, that this letter does not constitute a legal will and carries no direct legal authority. However, I am entering it into evidence as a statement of intent, particularly in the context of what is being argued here about testamentary capacity and undue influence. She looked at Diana's attorney. Counsel, you may proceed. Diana took the stand. She was poised. She had clearly been prepared carefully. She explained that she had accompanied her father to the Columbus lawyer's office because he had asked her to. She said she had waited in the lobby while he was seen. She said she had had no role in the drafting or the signing. She said she was simply honoring her father's wish to update his affairs. Robert cross-examined her quietly. He asked why, if she had waited in the lobby, her name appeared on the notarized signing record as present in the room. Diana paused. She said she had come in briefly at the end. Robert asked whether briefly at the end meant before or after the signing. She said she wasn't certain of the exact sequence. Robert paused. He let the silence sit in the room for a long moment. Then he asked whether she had a business relationship with a commercial real estate firm in Columbus that had sent a representative to assess the Merit hardware store 6 months before her father's death. Diana's attorney was on her feet immediately. The judge allowed the question. Diana said she didn't know anything about any business assessment. Robert submitted Tommy Driscoll's signed statement and the business card. After the hearing, Judge Morrow did not rule immediately. She took 3 weeks to review everything. I went back to Clover Falls. I reopened the hardware store, partly because the part-time employees needed their hours and partly because it was the only thing that made me feel close to my father. I stood behind the counter he had stood behind for 40 years, and I helped people find what they were looking for, and I tried not to count the days. The ruling came on a Monday. Robert called me while I was in the store's back office eating lunch. I remember the soup I was eating was still hot when I put it down to answer the phone. She ruled in your favor, Robert said. I put one hand flat on the desk. I didn't say anything for a moment. The judge found sufficient evidence of undue influence and impaired testamentary capacity to invalidate the revised will. The original will, the one dividing the estate equally between you and Diana, is restored as the governing document. It's equal. I said. Not, I don't get everything. Equal, as your father originally intended. 50-50. The house, the land, the store. I thought about that. I had spent 4 months thinking about fairness, about what was right, about what my father actually wanted. And what he had wanted, clearly and in his own words when he was well, was for both of his daughters to be provided for. Not for me to have everything and Diana nothing. Just for it to be right. That's what he wanted, I said. It is, said Robert. It is exactly what he wanted. I walked out into the store after I hung up. Tommy was helping a customer in the plumbing aisle. The afternoon light came through the front windows at a low winter angle and caught the dust motes floating in the air, the way I had seen it do 1,000 times as a child. The old floorboards creaked under my feet in the same spot they always had. I stood in the middle of that store and I let myself breathe. Diana did not call me the day the ruling came down. She didn't call the next day either. She called 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening. I almost didn't answer. But I did. She didn't apologize. Not exactly. What she said was, I told myself it was what he would have wanted. I told myself a lot of things. A pause. I don't know if we can come back from this. I don't know either, I said. But I know I'm not going anywhere. And I know what Dad actually wanted. So if you ever want to talk about what comes next, the store, the house, all of it, I'm here. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, okay. We didn't fix things that night. Things like this don't fix in a night. But I think about what my father wrote, not just what he wanted for the property, but what he said about Diana, that he didn't entirely blame her, that he understood how she'd become who she became, that he still loved her. He left me that too. Not just the letter asking me to fight, but the part asking me, when the fight was over, to remember she was still his daughter. I'm still working on that part. But here's what I know for certain. My father was a quiet man. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't leave a dramatic deathbed speech or a secret recording. He left a blue spiral notebook and a handwritten letter hidden behind his books and inside his keepsake box. And those small, ordinary, human things were enough. The truth he left behind was quiet, but it was stronger than every document Diana's lawyer could produce. Truth has a way of surviving. It hides in notebooks. It waits in wooden boxes. It sits patient and still while louder, more organized things make their arguments around it. And then one Monday morning a judge calls a lawyer and the lawyer calls you while your soup is still hot. And you find out that the quiet thing won. My father knew I'd find it. He knew I'd know what to do. He was right. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, because it's amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if this one stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you fought for, or something you wish you'd done differently, give it a like and subscribe, because every week we come back with another story about the people who chose truth even when it cost them everything.